So I want to bring into the conversation now from New York, Jason Brodsky, a policy director at United Against Nuclear Iran, and speaking to us from North Carolina, Brian O'Toole, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a former Treasury Department advisor dealing specifically with sanctions. Brian, I want to start with you. Those waivers we just talked about, some really key countries on that list, including maybe China at the top of it. Do you think that that dilutes the impact of these sanctions?
I don't. I actually argue, and I have for quite a while, that the waivers strengthen the impact of sanctions. You know, the waivers keep the money that Iran can make from its oil exports, whether they're illicit or whether they're smuggled, in basically host country financial institutions, basically the central banks of these other nations. And that's a safer place to have it because there it can only be used for approved bilateral trade. It's not that the IRGC can't get at some of it, but I think the IRGC's got a better chance of benefiting from kind of smuggling oil than the rest of the Iranian economy. And so the more money that you can tie up with these waivers, I think the better off the sanctions policy is.
Jason, so far that we've seen Tehran be defiant. We've heard, of course, Bolton talking about perhaps sterner sanctions. Is this going to be enough, or are sterner sanctions going to be needed to change Iranian policies?
Sterner sanctions are going to be needed, and it's great to be with you. The waivers that have been issued today by the administration need to be one-time, non-renewable, and after that, obviously stronger sanctions can come into effect. Also, we have to see what SWIFT is going to undertake, because SWIFT announced today that it's cutting off unnamed Iranian banks, but the identities of those banks remain to be seen. So there is a lot more the administration can do. And in addition, Iran's current central bank governor, Abdel Nasser Hemati, could be designated as a specially designated global terrorist, as his predecessor had been. This particular central bank governor had been the president of two recently sanctioned Iranian banks, Bank Melli and Sina Bank, and so there's a lot more the administration can do.
Brian, I want to go back to the issue of the Iranian people, because alongside all of these very tough sanctions, you have Iran and many others also claiming that this will actually just hurt the Iranian people themselves. Do you agree with that? Do you think that that is a risky byproduct of sanctions like these?
I think there is risk to it, and I think the administration has tried somewhat to talk up the humanitarian channels that it allows. I think they really could have done themselves a favor by hitting that harder today and maybe fully endorsing some sort of humanitarian channel, in part to take away that excuse by especially the government in Tehran, but also to actually deliver food, medicine, medical goods. Those things are really critically important if you're actually trying to play up to the people rather than just pay lip service to saying that.
And Jason, what about the potential impact on the Iranian leadership? We know there is internal divisions there. Some people describe it moderates versus hardliners, other hardliners, and even more hardliners. Where do you see the impact falling there?
Well, Hassan Rouhani has been under pressure since the U.S. has withdrawn from the agreement. He staked his legacy and his presidency on that agreement. And now, in recent weeks, we've seen his economy minister go down, his minister of industry, and as well as his minister of labor. And the impeachment attempts and the resignations are going to continue. But in the end, it'll just be reshuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic, unless and until Iran is prepared to make the structural changes to its economy in order to be connected to the global economy, then we're just going to see more of the same in Iran.
Well, Brian, I want to ask you about exactly that, sort of following that line of thought. Iran has been under sanctions for decades, and it has again and again chosen to spend a large bulk of its money in some of those conflicts across the Middle East. That's what we hear Pompeo and Trump and Mnuchin all talking about. Is there any reason to believe that these sanctions this time will actually get the Iranian regime to change its policy? Why now?
I think it's hard to really believe that, barring some sort of other external action, right? I think, the great weakness that the administration goes to these sanctions is it does not have the full force of the rest of the world, the way that we did in 2012 and 2013, heading into the actual JCPOA discussions. So I think that's going to undermine that impact and harm, the deterrent effect or the behavior change effect that they're seeking. And I think the other kind of aspect of this too is that the Iranians have shown a real reluctance to change their behavior. I think they recently just pushed back the counter-financing terrorism law back to the Majlis, which is a real problem for them when it comes to getting accepted into FATF, which is a key thing that they need to do if they actually want to bank with the rest of the world. So, unless there's some external shock, right, an internal collapse of the economy, some other political shock, I don't know that this is necessarily going to be the change that results in, what the administration wants to see.
Jason, let me ask you about an issue of certainly great concern here in Israel. As these sanctions bite, we heard Hassan Rouhani today say this is creating a war situation. Is there a danger that Iran will lash out, not at the U.S., but at other nations here in the region, including Israel?
Well, that line is for domestic consumption. I think that there's always the danger. The danger is ever present in Israel, as you know. And even while the nuclear deal was in effect, you had Hezbollah in Syria and an armed Iranian drone flying into Israeli airspace for the first time. So I think that the risk remains, and regardless of these sanctions and what comes next.